The stack shifts first, not a crash, not yet, just a slow, wrong-feeling lean. 6 containers high, somewhere in the North Atlantic during a storm. That's already been throwing 40-foot swells at this ship for the better part of 6 hours. Then the lashing rods give, one by one, faster than anyone on the bridge can do anything about it, and a single 40-foot steel box goes over the side. Inside that box, packed in foam and sealed crates, is roughly $2 million, in gold bars, luxury watches, and jewelry, heading from a refinery to a distributor on the other side of the ocean. Nobody watching from the bridge knows that specific detail, most of the crew doesn't either, and that's actually the first genuinely strange fact in this story because it's deliberate. But we'll get to that. Here's what I want you to sit with for a second, because I think almost everyone gets this wrong. You'd assume 2 tons of steel, packed with dense cargo, hits salt water and goes straight down. Gone, rock-solid logic, right up until you find out that container is now floating, quietly, almost invisibly, somewhere on the surface of the ocean. And it might stay there for weeks, maybe months, and here's the second fact that's going to bother you even more. If that container is never found, if $2 million in gold and watches sits on the seafloor forever, the shipping company that lost it may be legally required to pay the owner exactly $500. Not 500,500. I'm going to explain both of those facts properly because they're both completely true. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something about ocean shipping that almost nobody outside the industry actually knows. What actually happens hour by hour to a container after it goes over the side, where all of it ends up, and why an industry moving trillions of dollars in cargo every single year has quietly decided that losing track of some of it is just the cost of doing business. Let's start with the part that should be obvious and somehow isn't. Why does a 2-ton steel box float at all? It's the exact same principle we've talked about before on this channel with ships, and it applies here in a genuinely elegant way. A standard shipping container isn't solid steel, it's a sealed shell. Steel walls, steel floor, steel roof with a door that closes tight enough to be effectively watertight for a while. Inside that shell is a huge volume of trapped air, plus whatever cargo is packed in there, which usually doesn't fill every cubic inch of space. According to GARD, one of the major marine insurance associations that literally has to calculate this stuff for a living when settling claims, a fully loaded 20-foot container holds around 1,300 cubic feet of internal volume, and as long as the combined weight of the container and its cargo stays below the weight of the water that volume would displace, it floats. Exactly the same way a ship does. Here's the number that actually matters. That same insurer's estimate is that once enough seawater has worked its way in through the door seals, the floor, and the small ventilation holes, most containers have enough to push the total weight past roughly 83,000 pounds. The container finally goes under. Until that threshold is crossed, it just sits there, bobbing, doing what a sealed metal box full of air does, physics-wise, whether anyone wants it to or not. Now, how long does that actually take? This is where it gets genuinely unsettling, because the honest answer is, it depends wildly. And nobody watching from a ship half a mile away can tell just by looking at it. If the seals are damaged and the fall in water gets in fast, you might be talking about a container that's gone within a couple of days. But if the door held, if the cargo inside is naturally buoyant or doesn't displace much air, that same container can keep floating for a genuinely long time. GARD's own conservative estimate, averaging out the full range of real cases they've dealt with, puts it at roughly 3 months before a typical lost container finally sinks. 3 months, that's not a typo, and that's not the extreme upper bound, that's the average. Quick question for you: if you were sailing a small boat across open ocean, and somewhere out there was a rusting steel box, roughly the size of a shipping container, floating just below the surface, mostly submerged, completely invisible on radar, and nearly invisible to the eye until you're right on top of it, how would you feel about that? Because that's not a hypothetical, that's a documented, ongoing hazard that the entire yachting and small vessel community has to deal with. A container floating just under the surface doesn't look like a hazard. It doesn't look like anything. It's the exact shape and density of a submerged rock. Except it moves with the current, so it's never in the same place twice, and it's a lot harder for a hull to survive hitting than most rocks would be. This is a genuine, ongoing danger in open ocean shipping lanes, and it's one of the quieter reasons maritime authorities take container losses seriously, well beyond the value of whatever cargo was inside. So let's actually put a number on how often this happens, because the answer is going to surprise you in both directions depending on which year you're looking at. The World Shipping Council, the industry body that actually tracks this across its member companies, releases an annual report specifically counting lost containers. In 2023, the number hit a record low of just 221 containers lost across the entire year. Globally, the very next year, in 2024, that number jumped to 576. largely because ongoing conflict in the Red Sea forced a massive number of ships to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope instead, a route known for genuinely brutal sea conditions. And South African maritime authorities alone reported around 200 containers lost in that one region during the disruption. But zoom out to the 10-year average, and you land at 1,274 containers lost every single year, a number that includes the occasional catastrophic event that skews everything upward. Here's the context that actually matters, though, because taken alone, those numbers sound alarming. The World Shipping Council also points out that this represents roughly 0.0002% of the approximately 250 million containers shipped globally every year. So statistically, losing a container is an almost absurdly rare event. Which is exactly why, when it does happen to your specific $2 million shipment of gold and watches, that statistic is not going to be very comforting. Now let's get into the part of this story that I think genuinely nobody expects, because it's less about physics and entirely about law under the legal framework that governs most international ocean shipping. Going back to something called the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act and mirrored in similar international rules elsewhere, an ocean carrier's standard liability for lost cargo is capped, not at the value of what was inside, at a flat rate defined as $500 per shipping unit, and critically, shipping companies interpret unit as the entire container, not each individual item packed inside it. So legally, by default, if your 40-foot container carrying $2 million in gold and luxury watches goes over the side in a storm and is never recovered, the shipping line's baseline legal obligation to you is $500. Let that actually sink in for a second, because I don't think a number like that fully lands until you say it out loud twice. $2 million in cargo, $500 in guaranteed compensation. Here's the obvious follow-up question, and it's a fair one. So how does anyone actually ship anything valuable by sea without just accepting catastrophic risk every single time? Two answers, and they're both worth understanding, because together they explain almost everything about how the industry actually handles high-value cargo. The first is something called declared value shipping. A shipper who's sending something genuinely valuable can, before the voyage even starts, formally declare a higher value for that specific shipment and pay an additional fee for it, which raises the carrier's contractual liability above that default $500 cap. It's essentially an opt-in insurance layer built directly into the shipping contract. And any experienced logistics company moving precious metals, electronics, or luxury goods absolutely uses it. The second, and honestly the more heavily relied upon answer, is separate marine cargo insurance, purchased independently from a specialized insurer, which is where the real financial protection for high-value shipments almost always actually comes from. The shipping company's own liability is treated by the entire industry as a legal formality, not a safety net. And this brings us to the detail I mentioned right at the start. The one about why almost nobody on that ship's crew knew exactly what was inside the container that just went overboard. High-value cargo, precious metals, especially, is deliberately handled with about as little visible information as possible, manifests describing exactly which container holds what are treated as sensitive information, restricted to the people who genuinely need to know, specifically because a container clearly labeled or widely known to be carrying a fortune in gold becomes an obvious target. Whether that's for opportunistic theft in a port or, in rarer cases, something far more organized. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's standard logistics security practice. The maritime equivalent of an armored truck not having cash inside painted on the side. The safest container on a ship from a security standpoint is the one that looks exactly like the 8,000 other identical steel boxes stacked around it. So our theoretical $2 million container isn't just physically anonymous, sitting there in international orange or Maersk blue like everything else around it. It's informationally anonymous too by design, right up until the moment something goes wrong. And somebody has to explain, very specifically, exactly what was lost. Let's talk about what happens when something goes catastrophically wrong, because there's a real event that shows you exactly what this looks like at a scale that makes our single container feel almost quaint by comparison. In June 2013, a container ship called the MOL Comfort was sailing through the Indian Ocean, roughly 200 nautical miles off the coast of Yemen, fully loaded. When the crew reported the hull had cracked, within hours, that crack had become total structural failure. The ship broke completely in half mid-ocean, not damaged, not listing badly, physically split into two separate pieces, each one now an independent, uncontrolled hazard floating in open water. Every container on board that ship, all 4,293 of them, went into the ocean at once, not gradually over a storm-tossed hour like our earlier scenario. Essentially simultaneously, as the vessel's structure gave way entirely. Here's a question worth actually sitting with. If a single container can float for up to 3 months, invisible and dangerous to other ships, what does an event look like when over 4,000 of them enter the water, within the same few hours, scattered, across a stretch of one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet? The honest answer is that it becomes a genuinely enormous extended maritime hazard operation. Vessels transiting that region had to be actively warned for weeks afterward. Salvage crews spent a substantial amount of time trying to track, recover, and account for cargo that had scattered across a huge area of open ocean, some of it drifting for a very long time, before either being recovered or eventually sinking on its own. And this is before you even get to the ship itself. Both halves of the MOL Comfort eventually sank completely, one section going down within days, the other after an attempted tow, sinking as well not long after. The vessel was a near total loss, so was essentially its entire cargo. Investigators later pointed to structural weaknesses related to how large container ships of that specific class and era were built, and it became one of the most closely studied hull failure incidents in the modern container shipping industry, directly influencing how ships of that size are now inspected and reinforced. Now, back to our single container, the one still out there somewhere. 3 weeks after the storm that took it overboard, let's say it wasn't recovered in those first critical days, when it was still riding high and visible on the surface. Let's say the door seals held longer than average, the cargo inside didn't displace much air, and it just kept drifting, carried by currents nobody on land is actively tracking in real time. Eventually, water finds its way in, slowly at first, through the door gaskets, through the ventilation points every standard container has built into its design. The weight climbs, the buoyancy that's kept it floating starts losing the fight, and then it sinks properly, finally, straight down. Here's where the physics shifts in too. Something we've actually covered before on this channel. In a completely different context, once that container drops below a certain depth, water pressure stops being a minor inconvenience and starts becoming the dominant force acting on it. A shipping container is engineered to survive being stacked 8 or 9 high on a rolling ship deck, to survive a crane lifting it by its corner. Castings to survive the impact of ocean waves. Against its steel walls, it is absolutely not engineered to survive the crushing pressure of deep ocean water once it passes a few hundred meters down. Past that threshold, the same steel walls that kept it rigid and watertight on the surface can begin to deform and eventually collapse inward under pressure. The same fundamental principle that makes deep-sea engineering, submarines, and drilling equipment such a genuinely brutal design challenge, which we've gone deep on in earlier videos on this channel. So our container, or whatever's left of its structural shape, settles onto the seafloor, possibly a few hundred meters down, possibly several kilometers down. Depending on exactly where in that storm it finally lost the fight with the water pressure and gave up its buoyancy for good. And here's genuinely one of the strangest parts of this entire story. It doesn't just disappear from human knowledge and stay that way forever. Marine researchers, including teams working with protected areas like California's Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, actively study lost shipping containers that have settled on the seafloor within their surveyed zones, treating them as long-term case studies in exactly how quickly marine ecosystems adapt to, colonize, or get disrupted by large foreign objects suddenly appearing on the ocean floor, in a strange echo of something we covered in an earlier video about accidental rubber duck spills. Accidentally advancing oceanography, lost containers have occasionally become their own small, unplanned scientific opportunity, teaching researchers things about deep-sea currents, sediment behavior, and marine colonization patterns that would have been extraordinarily expensive to study on purpose. Our golden watches, assuming salt water and pressure haven't already destroyed the packaging entirely, are most likely still down there, sitting in the dark, sealed inside a slowly corroding steel box that nobody is actively looking for, because nobody outside a very small circle of insurance adjusters and logistics managers ever knew precisely which container it was in the first place, which brings us to the actual uncomfortable core of this entire story. The thing I think is worth genuinely sitting with after this video ends. The shipping industry has essentially made a calculated decision at a systemic level that finding every single lost container isn't worth the cost of trying. Recovery does happen. The World Shipping Council's own data shows that roughly a third of containers reported lost at sea are eventually recovered, usually the ones still floating and visible in the days immediately after they went overboard, close enough to shore or busy shipping lanes to justify sending a vessel out to grab them. But once something sinks in open ocean, genuinely tracking it down and physically retrieving it from potentially thousands of meters of water is, in almost every case, dramatically more expensive than whatever was lost. Gold and watches very much included. The insurance gets paid out, the loss gets logged, and the ocean quietly keeps the rest. Modern prevention has gotten meaningfully better, worth saying clearly. Improved lashing systems, better stowage planning software that accounts for weight distribution, far more precisely than older methods. DID and GPS tracking on individual containers are all reducing how often this happens in the first place. That steady decline in the official numbers over the past decade isn't an accident. It's the direct result of an industry that genuinely doesn't want to be doing this analysis in the first place. But prevention isn't elimination, and it never will be. Not for an industry moving 250 million containers across some of the most violent weather systems on the planet year after year. Somewhere out there right now, floating just under the surface or already resting on the seafloor. There are containers nobody's coming back for. Some of them almost certainly still hold something, worth a genuine fortune. So let's go back to where we started. A container goes over the side in a storm, carrying $2 million in gold and watches nobody on that ship's crew was ever meant to know about. It doesn't sink immediately, the way instinct tells you 2 tons of steel obviously should. It floats quietly, invisibly for what could be. Anywhere from a few days to several months. An entirely unmarked hazard to anything unlucky enough to cross its path. Eventually, saltwater wins, and it goes down for good, crushed by pressure somewhere in the dark, joining an entire scattered, mostly unmapped population of shipping containers, already sitting on ocean floors around the world, and the company responsible for losing it legally by default. Before insurance and declared value even enter the conversation, owes the owner exactly $500. Next time you're watching one of these massive container ships glide into port stacked 8 and 9 boxes high, it's worth remembering that every single one of those anonymous steel rectangles could be holding almost anything. Sneakers, electronics, furniture, or every once in a while, a genuine fortune, sailing across an ocean that has absolutely no idea and honestly doesn't particularly care what's inside. If this changed the way you'll look at a container ship the next time you see one, subscribe to Valnor. There's a lot more hiding inside the machines quietly running our entire world. And we're just getting started uncovering it.